Hi everyone, my name is Paras Chopra and today I'm with Dr. Kevin Gross. He's theoretical biologist and a professor at North Carolina State University. He uses dynamical and economic models to investigate how scientific norms, institutions, and culture affects production of science. His work is broadly situated in the emerging field of science, but particularly he's interested in exploring how funding bodies can more efficiently promote scientific welfare. His research has revealed that there are several inefficiencies in how science is funded today, which is primarily via grants. And to help remove those inefficiencies, he recommends exploration of alternative funding models, one of which is a radical idea of a partial lottery in which investigators compete for getting access to a funding lottery instead of getting access to funding. And this idea sounds very intriguing and counterintuitive, and that's broadly what we're going to discuss today. So I thank Dr. Kevin for your time today. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation.
Well, thank you, Paras. It's a pleasure to be with you and an honor to be part of your podcast. I certainly look forward to speaking with you and talking about some of these ideas.
Fantastic. So, Dr. Kevin, before we get into your research, I'm very interested in knowing the trajectory of your career. You're a theoretical biologist, but you also study meta science, which is science of science. These two things generally don't go together. So, how did you end up getting interested in knowing how science progresses and how different sort of things are structured within science?
Yeah, it's a bit of a winding path. So I went to graduate school to study ecological theory, which I was drawn to because it combined two of the things that I loved, which are mathematics and the outdoors. And so I thought it would be a way to sort of pursue both of those in the context of a single career. So I initially got my training in population dynamics, which is the use of mathematical models to understand how populations fluctuate in nature, non-human populations. And I have done that for some time, working both with mathematical models and statistical methods to analyze fluctuations in populations. And so, that was very enjoyable, but I think as time went on, I collected a series of observations, just anecdotally about how science worked. And there were some things that really mystified me about how science worked. But they were things that I would ponder, not anything that I ever thought about pursuing seriously. This changed 5 years ago when I was able to take a scholarly leave and go spend time with my now good friend and colleague, Carl Bergstrom, who's at the University of Washington, the Department of Biology there. Carl is also someone who had spent much of his career working at the interface of math and biology. Yeah. I actually went out there to work on something very different with Carl, and that kind of fizzled. We didn't get very far with it, and we discovered that we also had this mutual interest in what is now called the science of science, or just how science works. But what sort of working with Carl allowed me to do is that Carl knew how to do this in a serious way. So whereas before I just thought these were interesting things to ponder in idle moments, Carl knew how to work on these problems in a formal and rigorous way. And so that was very empowering. And so since then, we've collaborated closely on a few projects at this point now in the science of science, this funding project being one of them. And I've found it very rewarding for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not just Carl and myself. As you say, there are a number of other investigators sort of thinking along these lines, and it's sort of reached a critical mass to the point that now you can say there is an emerging discipline or field of the science of science. The philosophers of science will tell you that they've been doing this for a long time, and they have a point. But I think this new sort of, whether you call it meta science or science of science or meta research, it encompasses more than philosophy. There's a little bit of sociology, there's a little bit of economics to it, and there's some statistics to it, which is sort of gives me a bit of my own personal angle on things. Right. So sort of simultaneously, there's also this growing energy in this broader field, the science of science, that gives Carl and I sort of a venue or a community to tap into with our own results. And that's important too, because this is a science of science observation about the science of science. But you need to have very meta, yes. You need to have a critical mass, right? There need to be journals that are willing to publish your research. And in order for journals to publish your research, they have to be able to find reviewers who can review what you've done. And so you need you can't be the only person in the world working on something.
Right.
Because then you're sort of shut out of the scientific ecosystem.
Yeah.
So sort of simultaneously, there are now enough people sort of working in this area. I know you've spoken to some of them yourself. I know you recently spoke with James Evans at Chicago. So he's working in this area as well. So sort of simultaneously, there's some growing energy in this field of the science of science. Which gives us a community to tap into.
Like you said, it's so meta because science of science is new. And so, I mean, everyone has to be outside of science, because this field doesn't exist. So you couldn't have gotten formal training. And nobody could have gotten formal training because this is not an established field as of now. It's an emerging one. And it's interesting that, like you said, there has to be like a supporting infrastructure, journals, conferences, and so on, to really formalize a discipline. So I guess in future, researchers like yourself can look back and see how a field sort of bootstraps, because it's literally in the process right now.
Well, we'll see where it goes. I think we're at the stage now that certain journals have sections that are dedicated to meta research or meta science. There aren't whole journals yet. Again, you could argue that the philosophy of science has been doing this for a long time. But so things are growing. I wouldn't I wouldn't be so brazen as to make a prediction about where things are going to be 10 or 15 years from now. But I think it's a very exciting time. There's a lot of energy and a lot of momentum. So things are certainly growing right now.
But one of the things that seems different this time is there is a lot of quantitative angle. In philosophy of science, it has its place, but it is very qualitative. It is philosophy, but with your research and with, say, James Evans and other research, it just seems you're applying quantitative models to really analyze science, and that seems different than what has happened before.
Different in degree. I should say I can't really speak intelligently to what bounds the philosophy of science. I do think there is some quantitative work in there, but certainly like the work that James Evans is doing and the work that Carl and I are doing and the work that other researchers in the field are doing is sort of bringing in some thought traditions from some other maybe more quantitative disciplines such as economics and statistics. So I wouldn't say we're this wave is the absolute first to do quantitative things, but there certainly is sort of a new emphasis, new energy in quantitative areas, I suppose.
That's great. So coming to the topic of how science is funded, for the benefit of listeners, can you talk about how science is funded today? I'm sure there would be people who have an interest in knowing this, but wouldn't know what grants are and so on and so forth. So.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big question, and I can't speak to it in its entirety. And I can really only speak to the parts of that system that I know.
Okay.
So I work in the U.S. And here in the U.S., the most public funding for science comes from the federal government. And through a variety of agencies. The two big players are the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. The primary mechanism by which both of those agencies distributes their funding is through a series of what we call proposal competitions. So where if an investigator, if someone has an idea that they want funding for, they write a proposal. And the proposal describes, among other things, the scientific rationale for the study that they want to do and their plan for how they are going to execute the study. It includes some other things. It includes budget. It includes some other sort of ways of rounding out the project. Those proposals are solicited by the funding agencies. The proposals come in, and then the funding agencies convene panels of expert reviewers. So they find other investigators in the field who are not actively participating in that particular competition to read these proposals and evaluate them against a variety of criteria. Those criteria differ depending upon the agency, but one of the things that the agencies are looking for is the scientific merit of the proposal, or the promise, which you might say. These panels of reviewers then convene and rank the proposals. The agencies take those rankings into account, introduce some other criteria, and then make their decisions about which of those projects to fund and which not to fund. This in the US, as I understand it, has been the predominant model since about the 50s, the 1950s, the post-war era, which was sort of the beginning of the modern age in the US of federal funding of science. That was, again, I'm not a historian. I probably should know this better than I do. But the National Science Foundation was created in the 50s. The National Institutes of Health, there were sort of, again, it's a collection of institutes that had existed prior to the 1950s, but they came together under one umbrella at about the same time. Anyway, the interesting thing to note, and this is sort of an interesting part of the story, is that in that era, in the 50s and 60s, when this model of writing proposals for funding solidified, those agencies had enough funds to award about between 30 and 60% of the proposals that they received based upon the funding program. So to back up a little bit, it's important to note that when the proposals come in, they don't all go into one big hopper. They get sorted by discipline. So, when I was doing population dynamics, if I wrote a proposal about population dynamics, it would go into a competition where I was competing against other people who were writing proposals in ecology or related fields. It wouldn't be competing against geology or astrophysics or other fields of science.
This happens every year?
Yes. And sometimes it even happens more frequently than once a year. So the frequency, even in recent history, has changed in the National Science Foundation. Again, there isn't one uniform frequency, but the frequency tends to be between once a year and twice a year.
Okay.
So somewhere in that range. So the entire cycle takes between 6 and 12 months.
Okay.
So again, in the early days of these funding competitions, about 30 to 60% of the proposals were being funded, depending upon what realm of science you were talking about. And one of the things to foreshadow a little bit that my work with Carl suggests is that in that era, when you were able to fund that many of the proposals that you received, this idea of writing a proposal competition was a good idea. It made a lot of sense because you could demonstrate, an investigator could demonstrate that they had a decent idea without a huge amount of work, because you were only trying to get into that top 30 to 60%, what have you.
Right.
In any event, fast forward now 60 years. And what's happened in the intervening time is that the number of investigators seeking federal funds has grown very quickly. The funding available has also grown, but it's not grown as quickly as the number of investigators seeking funds.
Okay.
And so the percentage of incoming proposals that the agency can award has gone down. And so again, this varies by discipline, but at a sort of a very coarse level at the National Institutes of Health, the funding rate in these days is in the low 20%, so 20, 21, 22%. In ecology, in the part of the National Science Foundation that I was most familiar with, a few years ago, the funding rate was down to 4%.
Oh.
Meaning that they were only funding 4% of the proposals that they received. And to foreshadow a little bit, what Carl and I have argued is that as the funding rate drops, this idea of asking investigators to write proposals to justify their ideas creates a lot more waste. It becomes a lot more inefficient when the funding rates are very low. So a big part of this story is that in the US, at least, the amount of funds available at these big federal funding agencies has not kept pace with the number of investigators who are competing for those funds. And as a result, the percentage of proposals that has gotten funded has declined.
Right. So this 4% funding rate seems frankly shocking, because this just means 95% are not getting funded. And is it true funding is the main source for scientists to sort of even do science professionally?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, to be clear, that 4% number has since rebounded. It's a bit higher now. It's never clear exactly how you count, because sometimes projects can be awarded, but awarded without their full budget. So, you might request $600,000 and get $300,000 funded. So, it's always a little bit unclear how you count this. But in any event, that 4% is kind of the nadir. that was sort of the low point. So let's not fixate on that number. But, I think it is fair to say that across a lot of major funding programs, the funding rates are between maybe 10 and 20%.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking in terms of what sort of psychological pressure does it create, and what sort of what does this as a negative incentive do to A, scientists, and B, the production of science, as a society?
Yeah. Well, okay. So you asked a moment ago if that's the major source of funding. Yes, at least for science and academics. So, another wrinkle here is that, at least in the American system, there are two types of positions. One position, the type of position that I'm on, for example, is called a hard money position, meaning that I have a base salary that covers my work for 9 months of the year. But if I want to either receive salary during the summer, which is not funded by my institution, or do anything else, have a research budget, I've got to get that money from somewhere else. That stands in contrast to a lot of faculty at medical schools in the US who are on quote unquote soft money positions, where they don't even have a base salary. If they do have a base salary, it's very small. They're responsible for generating most of their own salaries through external grants. So not only do they have to bring in the research funds to fund their research, to fund their labs, to pay for all the stuff in the lab, they also have to pay for their own salary. So that is a much more stressful position. And to the extent that we have the data now suggests that people in those positions spend up to half their time writing grants, because they're under so much pressure to pay themselves, to pay the people who work for them, to fund their labs. People on hard money positions like myself who have a base salary, and the data suggests that people in those positions spend about 10 to 20% of their time writing grants. But however you slice it, that's a huge amount of time. If you think about how the academic scientific workforce in the US, and I'm focusing on the US because that's what I know, but I think there are similar stories that you could tell in other parts of the world. Certainly this model of funding science through proposals is not just an American thing. It's a model that is used throughout the world. But this is a huge amount of time. It's a huge amount of pressure, as you mentioned. So the psychological cost is quite intense. Faculty are under great pressure to acquire grants. One of the things that's happened in the course of my career, so I've been working as a faculty member for about 20 years now. And one of the things that's happened in my career that has been sort of a shift that I've noticed is that, when I was first hired, it used to be that in order to keep my job, I would have to get a grant. And so that was one of the primary criteria for gaining tenure and continuing to be employed as an academic scientist, was getting a grant. Well, now in the current day and age, at some institutions at least, because so few people are actually successfully getting grants, the criterion has now become that you have to apply for a grant. Not that you have to get it, but you have to apply for it. And I would submit that that's nuts. It's mistaking grants for science in its completed form. Grants are inputs to the research process. They're not outputs. And so we've had this really sort of, I think, perverse shift where administrations who used to be in the habit of requiring their faculty to get grants now realize they can't require them to get grants because the success rate is so low but they still want to pressure their investigators to try to get those grants, so they require their investigators to apply for grants. But I would contend that that's silly, because it's, again, making the mistake of thinking about grants as completed science, which they're not. They're proposals for science. They're an input to the scientific process. They're not an output. Anyway, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
But yes, to answer your question, yes, there's huge pressure on faculty to get grants.
So to capture the discussion so far, is it fair to say in 50s, when these grants making process was started, the win rate was 50 to 60%, and ever since then, the number of people competing for grants that has grown substantially faster than the amount of funding. So the win rate has lowered to maybe 20% or so. And the effect of that is that because the win rate is lower, each of the individual academic scientist has to work much harder on the grant proposal. And because there are more number of people applying for grants, in aggregate as a society, we're just wasting more time.
Right. So I think the key here is that it's a competitive mechanism. And so like compare those two situations, right? So in the good old days, if you will, when the funding rates were high, I mean, suppose that you had an idea that you wanted to get funding for, you would try to write a proposal to demonstrate that you had a good idea. And the bar that you would have to clear would be here, say. Yeah. You'd have to only demonstrate that you're in the top 50% of the ideas. Now, in this day and age, if the funding rate is lower, the bar is higher. But the key is that that bar is set by how hard everybody else is working. So not only is the bar higher because fewer proposals are being funded, but everybody else is working harder too. And so now the bar is even higher. And so there's a little bit of a snowball effect, that as the funding rate drops, not only do you have to demonstrate that you have a idea that's in the sort of very upper tier of ideas, but you have to compete against other people who are also trying to demonstrate that their idea is in the upper tier as well. And so there's sort of a runaway process with respect to how much time people are putting into writing proposals that causes the amount of time people are writing proposals to go up very fast as the funding rate drops.
Yeah, this does beg the question, why hasn't, and you may not have the perfect answer, nobody may have, but I'm curious why funding hasn't kept pace with the number of scientists applying for funding.
Yeah, that's above my pay grade. Well, I mean, so again,
but what's your guess?
These things are always subject to political winds. So remember that the pay rate has both a numerator and a denominator. And so I think one aspect of this is that the denominator is growing very quickly. And the reason why the denominator is growing very quickly is because of a lot of institutions, like the one that I work for, I think said, well, look, this is great. We're only going to hire the best faculty, and we're going to hire the faculty who are going to be successful at getting these grants. And if they get grants, then we can have this federal government pay their salary instead of us having to pay their salary. And so I think to some extent, it was an effort by the institutions to get the external agencies to fund their operations. So it was a little, but so, to some degree, the reason why more people are seeking funding is because the institutions that they work for have cut back on their internal support in an effort to motivate their faculty to bring in more money. But you can see the problem there is that if every institution does that, there isn't more money to go around, right? And so like it's a coordination problem. Is that every institution tells themselves, well, we're going to hire, the people who are going to be successful at getting these grants. And so therefore we can reduce our own investment in them because we're going to make sure that they are able to bring in funds from outside. But if everybody does that at the same time, you can't have everybody being successful at bringing in funds from the outside. So in the US, at least, I think it's as much a story of the denominator increasing But more people being under pressure to bring in money from outside to support their research, from outside the institution they work for to support their research, as much as it is a story about the numerator. The federal government has increased its support for basic science. It's not smooth, right? There are years when the federal government invests a lot, and years when the budget is flat. And you can imagine the political factors that come into play there.
Right.
But I think part of the story, and maybe an underappreciated part, is that a number of investigators who had previously relied on internal institutional support to fund their research are now being asked to bring in that money from outside via these large federal funding agencies.
Right. And when you said that everyone has to work hard because the bar has gotten higher, as a bar, since that bar is comprised of judgment from experts, and I'm not sure how objective it is, so I would love to hear your points of how does a community of scientists respond to this? I don't even know how should I phrase it, subjective bar or constantly moving bar? Because it doesn't seem like a linear scale. It's not like obviously an Olympic tournament where it's just fixed and
right. Right. Yeah, that's a great point, and I thank you for asking that question. That's a great insight. We haven't even begun to talk about the fact that evaluating the scientific promise is a human endeavor, and it's limited by the knowledge and expertise of the review panels that the agencies assemble. Our model, the work that I've done with Carl, is sort of a best case scenario where we assume that the review panels are able to accurately rank incoming proposals with respect to their scientific promise, with a little bit of noise, right? We allow for the fact that the rankings are never perfect, but we assume that on the whole, the cream does rise to the top, if you will. The most promising scientific ideas are recognized as promising by the review panel. So the work that we've done is something of a best case scenario. In reality, are review panels really able to identify the most promising science? That's a very interesting question. And it's very hard to get good data on that, because the only way that you really could figure that out would be to do an experiment where you had two sets of proposals, one set of proposals where you had a set of peer reviewers try to rank them, and another set of proposals where you just gave the money out completely at random. And no one's done that experiment that I know of. So we don't actually know as much as we would like about how effective review panels are at identifying the most promising science. There is the folklore, I guess, for lack of a better word, in the US, that as the funding rate goes down, that review panels become more conservative, in the sense that they don't fund risky projects. They don't take chances on risky projects as the funding rate goes down. I don't know if that's true. It certainly, I think, agrees with a lot of people's experience. And Carl and I have thought about that, but we haven't really figured out what the mechanism might be behind that. But I think that certain people would lots of people would sort of agree that seems to be what's happened. Why that is not a question at this point that we can shed much light on.
I think it depends on what are these expert panels incentivized on. I'm not sure, but their incentives would drive what sort of proposals they end up selecting.
Yeah. So this is an interesting point, right? That you can argue that the riskiest science is a science that most people don't think is going to work. That's what makes it risky.
Yeah.
And that type of science is going to fail in this type of process, because the peer reviewers are going to then think that it's not likely to work. So that's a very interesting insight, and one that Carl and I and lots of other folks would like to understand better, is how does the fact that you have to have your proposal blessed by a community of peers, how does that affect the types of projects that people choose to propose anyway. In some sense, it does limit you. I mean, you can't really propose something that only you think is going to work. Because if only you think it's going to work, then it's not going to win the blessing of your peers. So I think there tends to be the whole reliance on peer review tends to shrink the space of ideas that people are willing to seek funding for in the first place.
Right. And you model the wastage that goes in writing proposals that do not get funded, essentially. But do you also model the wastage of effort in evaluating proposals? Because as number of proposals go up, the cost of evaluating them must go up as well.
No, we didn't, and you're exactly right. So our analysis only looks at the cost in terms of time spent writing proposals and the benefit in terms of the science that the funded proposals ultimately underwrite, and compares just those two. So the basic calculation of our model is that to a first approximation, time spent writing proposals is time taken away from doing science. And so that's the cost. And then the benefit is that when a funding agency does make an award, that award is going to support some degree of scientific discovery. So those are the costs and benefits that we compare. I think I feel fairly comfortable in arguing that those are the primary costs and benefits, but they're not the only ones by any means. So there certainly are other costs. The cost that you mentioned, the cost of the effort that reviewers have to spend reviewing these proposals is certainly a big one. I've been on review panels several times, and it's a lot of work. And then you have to multiply that by the number of people who are on the review panel. And there are other benefits as well. So for example, some will argue that, just the act of trying to put your ideas together to write a proposal has some scientific benefit, which is fair. Again, I don't think that's a large scientific benefit relative to the major costs and benefits that we analyze, but there certainly are others. Like the one that you mentioned, the time that reviewers have to spend reviewing these proposals.
Right. For the benefit of listeners who've never sort of seen a grant proposal,
Sure.
I was Googling grant proposals before our discussion, and I realized sometimes they're just pages and pages of, they're long, sometimes they're almost mini books. And like you said, they are inputs to science rather than an output. So it just seems spending so much effort on one grant proposal and multiply that by thousands and thousands of competitors. That seems a lot of effort that society puts in.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Go ahead.
No, I'm curious in terms of, I know you suggest some alternative funding models, and we'll come to that. But is it surprising? Your discovery or your research, does it make surprising conclusions, or does everyone know that, but they don't know how to sort of shift to, say, a better equilibrium?
I think our work has been in part successful because it taps into a frustration that lots of people have with the current system. I think lots of people, again, in the US, I can't really speak more broadly than the US, I think lots of folks are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied with the stress on the investigator side that you mentioned. They're dissatisfied with the proportion of time that they spend writing proposals. And I think it's frustrating being a reviewer too, when you see 30 good ideas and are asked to find the best 5 and realize that, you can assemble 15 of the best experts, and they're all going to come up with a different list of what are the 5 best out of those 30 ideas. And so how do you resolve that? There are lots of aspects of the system that I think people are quite frustrated with. So to argue that the current system is inefficient is not surprising. I think what's more surprising is to argue that it's a function of the competitive dynamics as opposed to the particular logistics of how the competition is run. And so there are a couple of interesting stories in that regard. one that's not an American story, but it's an Australian story. The Australians, some time ago, as I understand it, decided to overhaul the actual template for these small books that you mentioned that people are writing, to try to reduce the size of those books, to reduce the size of the proposal by half. Thinking that, well, it was just the volume of pages that people were being asked to produce that was generating a lot of this waste. And so they cut back on the size of the proposals. And then did a study after the fact to ask if people were actually spending less time, and they found out that people were actually spending more time to write a shorter proposal than they were to write a longer proposal. And so it's stories like that I think that illustrate that it's not the details of the proposal that cause investigators to spend a lot of time. It's the fact that you're competing with other investigators who are doing the same thing. So it's the competitive dynamics of the process that drive the waste, as opposed to trying to microengineer, say, how the proposal is put together. I mean, obviously that has its limits, right? If we were to say, well, just limit the proposal to one page, then obviously there's only so much time you can spend in writing one page. But that no one, I don't think, would seriously consider that anyway for a major funding competition. So within the realm of sort of styles of proposal that you might seriously consider, microengineering the format of the proposal is not the answer.
Okay.
Because the ultimate root of the problem, again, is the fact that we have lots of people competing for a very small number of prizes.
Okay. So current system of funding via these competitive grants has inefficiencies. How do we improve upon it? What are some of the suggestions that you put forward?
Yeah. Okay. So let's it's useful at this point, I think, to recap what the main ingredients are that cause the inefficiencies. So sure. One, as you mentioned, that you have lots of people competing for a small number of awards. But secondly, again, we are sort of working from the assumption that the proposals that they're writing are, to a first approximation, waste. Again, because nobody reads outside of the review committee, nobody reads those proposals, nobody publishes them. They're not as valuable as science in their completed form. They have some scientific value, but it's small relative to the scientific value of science in its completed form. And so those are the main ingredients that cause the process to be wasteful. And so you can work with those insights to ask, what else could you do to recover efficiency, to make the process less wasteful? And there are two primary mechanisms here. And the first mechanism is to say, okay, instead of having lots of people compete for a small number of big awards, go to having people compete for a large number of small awards. And so that would take the funding rate, which we previously said was now sort of down in the 10 to 25 to 20% range, and increase the percent of people who are getting funded, but decrease the size of the award. According to the predictions of our model, that would sort of place you back in the same spot that you were in the 50s and 60s, when lots of people were getting awarded, and sort of reverse that snowball process that we talked about. So now, if you've got a good idea, you only have to demonstrate it's in the top 50%. So that lowers the bar. And not only that, but now everybody who you're competing against is also working less hard, because they're only trying to demonstrate that their idea is in the top 50%. So that brings the bar down. And so how do you do that then? How do you replace a competition with a small number of big prizes with one with a big number of small prizes? Okay, well, there are two ways. One, which works for some realms of science but not others, is that you could just, instead of charging the review panel with identifying the top, say, 10% of awards, you could instead charge the review panel with saying, just identify all the ideas that have merit, all the ideas that are worthy of funding. And if that happens to be 25% or it happens to be 50%, so be it. And then after the review panel has done their work, we'll just take whatever money we have, whatever the size of the available pot is, and we'll divide it up evenly among those people who have meritorious ideas. And so the idea is to, slice the pie however thinly you need, so that everybody who's got a meritorious idea gets a piece of the pie. Now, that works great for somebody like me, who does all my work on a computer. If I write a grant for $100,000 a year and wind up only getting $20,000 a year back, I can still do something with that $20,000 a year. It doesn't work well for somebody who does something like deep ocean research. Okay, you're not going to get very far with 20% of a boat. So there are some fields of science where small slivers of money just aren't very effective. And so that sort of idea only works in fields of science where small slivers of money are still worthwhile. So that's one idea. The other way to shift the competition so that you're competing for a large number of small awards is this lottery idea. So instead of investigators competing for grants, they're competing for lottery tickets for a grant. And so to be clear, this is not our idea. This is an idea that's been kicking around for some time now. The first known that I know of suggestion of this idea in the literature was in the late 1990s. Surely it goes back further than that. And so the idea here is that, again, instead of review panels being charged with identifying the few projects that are going to get funded, the review panels instead are asked to evaluate the proposals against a much lower bar. And the proposals that clear that bar, instead of getting an award, get a lottery ticket for an award. Then all those lottery tickets go into a bucket and you determine who gets the money by chance. That's the same mechanism as giving out small slivers of the pie, except that it preserves the size of the award. So now, I want $100,000. I submit a proposal, and I'm just competing for a lottery ticket that gives me a 1 in 5 chance of getting that $100,000. So that lottery ticket is still effectively worth $20,000. But again, because you can't do much with 20% of a boat, you're just using random chance to determine who gets the full award and therefore can sail on their cruise to do the deep ocean research, and which institutions don't.
Right.
So those are two different ideas sort of under the same umbrella of increasing the number of awards and reducing the value of the award. So
the essential mechanism is lowering the bar so that everyone competes less hard. They invest less time.
That's exactly it, right? I mean, once you have, so this is sort of an interesting way to think about it. You could never do this because it's lying. But the best competition would be one that you advertise as a lottery, but then actually run as a full-fledged competition. So tell people it's going to be a lottery, so that people, or a qualifying lottery, I should be clear. Tell people it's going to be one with a low bar, so people don't work that hard, and then actually evaluate the proposals. Again, you could never do that because that's lying, and you can't lie. But with respect to reducing the amount of effort that people put in, that would be the ideal. Now, given that you can't lie, what we're arguing is that you could still recover efficiency by having a sort of this, one of these ideas where you're just reducing the value of the award. Again, so you're sort of reversing the clock. You're going back to the days when the bar is lower. When all you're trying to do here with this proposal is you're trying to sort the reasonable ideas from the unreasonable ones. All you're trying to do. You're not trying to identify the cream of the crop, the creme de la creme, the top 5%. That's where the waste comes in, is when you're trying to figure out, okay, what are the best of the best? All you're trying to do with the proposal competition is separate the good from the bad. Right. And so that's sort of the idea, is to raise the success rate, raise the funding rate, so that everybody who has a good proposal succeeds. Of course, with limited resources, right? Succeeds has got to mean either getting a lottery ticket or getting a much reduced award relative to the size of the award that they asked for.
Right. It seems, there is, like you said, there is an inherent trade-off between awarding people who have genuine merit and making sure everyone doesn't put in so much of hard work and wastage. You can't have both. The perfect competition would be you advertise as lottery, but then you evaluate on merit. But if we go the lottery route, do you feel I was reading a research, maybe it was more of an anecdote, that a lot of Nobel Prize winners have actually studied under other Nobel Prize winners. And there is this sort of thing going on where a lot of highly cited research is done by very few people, very few scientists. And via lottery mechanism, if they are unable to get funding for their research, does it actually create a net loss for the society?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's important to note that there are multiple sources. There's still another alternative that we have yet to talk about. So let's just so let me mention that, and then we'll circle back around to your question,
sure.
if that's okay.
Yes.
Sure. Okay. So the other mechanism then is, instead of awarding based on proposals for future science, making records based more, if not entirely in part, on individuals' recent productivity. So the idea there is that you still hold a competition, but instead of people writing proposals that no one else is going to read besides the review panel, the competition is based on, well, how much science have you, what's the quality of the science you've produced in the past 5 years? And so that's sort of shifting the competition, where now you're taking all that effort that people are putting in, and they're putting it into actually generating science, as opposed to writing these proposals that nobody's going to read. So sort of the other class of mechanisms is you shift the effort. You shift the effort away from proposals and you shift it towards science in its completed form. Now, that has drawbacks too. And I should hasten to add that the major drawbacks to that is that it runs the risk of perpetuating these rich get richer loops, or increasing barriers to science for previously underrepresented groups, which is something that nobody wants to do. And we've got to be very careful not to do that. So we have to be very clear that, if we do something along these lines, that we've got to be engineer it in such a way that we're very on guard against and prevent sort of raising new barriers to entry into science. Yeah. But I suggest this idea because I think there are ways to do it. And I think there are other funding programs in other countries that you can think of that do factor in recent past productivity more strongly into the award, and do so in a way that doesn't erect new barriers to entry into science. Now, right. You'd have to be careful about how you do that. I mean, obviously, you can't have the same criteria for someone at the beginning of their career as you do for someone in the middle stages of their career. And so maybe you could make the people at the beginning of their career, you could make sort of shift the funding criteria to weight the quality of the proposal more heavily. And then as you get to people who are later in the career, start to emphasize past productivity more in the award process. So in any event, I think we can identify at least 3 different alternatives to the current model that might be more efficient. And I think it's important to have several alternatives, because you're not going to have a one size fits all solution that, again, sort of based on the nature of the science, and based on sort of the divisibility of the awards. This idea what we talked about before about you can't have 1/20th of a vote, or 20% of a vote, excuse me. There are some sort of infrastructure awards, which instead of funding researchers are awards to build large sort of pieces of scientific infrastructure. I would never want to give those out by lottery. I'd certainly want to make the big infrastructure awards, trying to find, give that money to, don't introduce any sort of randomness in how that money is given out. So, there certainly are upsides and downsides to all these alternatives. You could also argue that a lottery actually might be discouraging to investigators who perceive themselves, whether accurately or not, but who perceive themselves as good enough to get a grant under the current system. And so another risk with the lottery system is that, if you have one sort of agency offering their awards by lottery and another agency offering their awards by the more conventional system, you might shift where investigators put their energy based on where they perceive themselves to be against the rest of the field. That's a question that Carl and I haven't been able to investigate as deeply as we would like quite yet. But in any event, you've got to acknowledge that with a lottery, there's a chance that the most promising proposal in the bucket is not going to get funded. Again, you can engineer this though. You can modify it. You can say, all right, instead of ranking the proposals as either qualifying for the lottery or not qualifying for the lottery, we can have a proposal of the very best, a bucket of the very best proposals that are going to get funded, absolutely. A bucket of the intermediate proposals that are going to go into the lottery, and then a bucket of the the proposals that don't have merit that we're not going to fund. So you would have these sort of hybrid systems to try to guard against that. But a hybrid system is also going to have sort of an intermediate efficiency between the current system and the and just an in or out lottery.
I wanted to build upon the comment you made in sense of if there are multiple competing funding agencies, prestige could lead people to still invest a lot of effort into the funding body that's evaluating grants, not by lottery, but by merit. I guess, if I think very broadly, that's what happens in a lot of places, in a lot of contexts. Even something as simple as writing the college application. A lot of students, of course, the prestige of big universities drive their endurance as well, right? Stanford, Harvard, and a lot of other well-known universities. There is sort of like a network effect. I'm not sure if there is a competing university that says we'll take half of the students who apply. That will increase efficiency.
Yeah.
So I think you do mention a little bit about prestige. So can you build on that?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll make a couple of comments. First, as an anecdote, in response to your comment about university admissions, I will point out that in some contexts, societies with limited resources do think about randomness as a very fair way to allocate scarce resources. And one anecdote that comes to mind is I don't have first-hand experiences with this, but I've been told by a number of individuals that in the Netherlands, admission to medical school is done by a qualifying lottery. So there are only so many slots for each year in medical school, and there are more qualified applicants than they have slots. And so, as I understand it, the system is applicants have to demonstrate that they are qualified, but then among those who are qualified, admission to medical school is done by lottery. There was even talk not long ago about giving out COVID vaccines by lottery as a fair way to allocate COVID vaccines. That idea didn't seem to take root, I think, because we're all hopeful that there will be enough vaccines soon enough that we don't have to implement a lottery. But I point out that in other contexts, society is very comfortable with this idea of using some degree of randomness to give out scarce resources in meaningful contexts. Now, in terms of the prestige issue that you mentioned, I think like any research, the research that I've done with Carl on this issue has its limitations. And one of the major limitations is that so far we only consider one funding program in isolation. And what we do not consider is that funding program as part of a bigger funding landscape. And that's absolutely an important question to consider in terms of, again, how would investigators shift their effort if they were able to choose among a menu of funders, some of which were using lottery-based systems and others of which weren't? I think here in the U.S. there are a number of scientific disciplines for which the number of funders is relatively small. I don't think people are really picking and choosing that much about who they apply for. They're applying every chance they get to get funding because funds are so scarce that you can't be picky. But I think to have a more complete understanding of how a partial lottery would function, we do need to understand how it operates within a larger funding landscape in which investigators do have some choice into where they put their effort applying for funds.
Okay. So yours is a theoretical model with a finding. I'm curious if there is any empirical evidence or support for some of the alternative models that you've proposed.
So let's see. That's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. There are some small funders who have started giving out awards using this idea of a qualifying lottery. They've done this a bit in New Zealand at a federal level, a governmental level. I don't know if federal is the right word. There are also some private funders, particularly in Germany, who've given out small awards by lottery. One of the difficulties here is that it just takes a long time to evaluate the science that these funding programs produce. It's a really long soak time. And if you think about, science is just, there's just a long pipeline to science. And then even after something gets published, it takes a lot longer to figure out what the impact of that science is going to be. So at some time in the future, yes, we will be able to look back and ask whether or not these funding programs in New Zealand and in Germany and other places, we will be able to at least assess the science that they're producing. Again, it's not a controlled experiment, so we won't necessarily have the ability to directly assign causation to the lottery, but at least we'll be able to look back again. But that day is a long way down the road. The other system that comes to mind, and maybe this comes to mind more for those of us in North America, is a lot of people seem to regard the Canadian system as a saner system for giving out research money. And the Canadian system does, as I understand it. They give out smaller awards, but they do factor in, especially for experienced investigators, they factor in recent past productivity more strongly than we do here in the US. Now, there are some other big differences. And one big difference between Canada and the US is that as I understand it, in Canada, grants are not used to fund graduate students. In the US, grants are a major source not only of say, investigators paying their own salaries, but also paying the salaries of their graduate students. That's also sort of increases the size of the award. In Canada, investigators are not paying for graduate student salary on their grants, so they can get further with a smaller award. All of which is to say that there are other differences between the Canadian system and the US system beyond just evaluating senior researchers based on recent past productivity. But again, I think a lot of my colleagues here in the US tend to envy the Canadian system as a saner system that doesn't waste as much time, investigator time, futilely chasing grants. So, I mean, that's not direct empirical evidence, but it's something.
Okay. So, Dr. Kevin, since we are at the end of our 1 hour conversation, I wanted to wrap up by asking a question which could be maybe almost philosophical, but I wanted to sort of have your comment on why does this matter as a society? Why should we care about how science is funded? Where do you place this question in the broader context of, say morality in the sense?
No, that's a good question. Well, I think at one level we're talking about just what does the taxpayer get for their dollar, for their investment in science. I mean, what we're talking about here is trying to increase the scientific welfare, trying to increase the science that the taxpayer gets for their public investment. Right now, when the funding rates are very low, I would argue that lots of what the taxpayer is getting is they're getting proposals that nobody ever reads. And that's not a good investment. So, I think the motivation here is to increase the public's return on its investment in science, in terms of increasing the production of scientific knowledge, the rate at which that knowledge is produced as with regards to how much the public invests. So I would argue that the ultimate motivation here is to increase the return on investment, the scientific return on investment that society makes in science.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that makes total sense. I mean, as science is majorly funded by the government, and I think as a taxpayer, we all demand the best. I mean, why wouldn't you pursue higher efficiency? So thank you so much, Dr. Kevin, for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. There is just so much to unwrap, and I will look forward to future research on the same line from you and Dr. Kaul.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the time. It's been a pleasure to chat. I've enjoyed our time.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.